الصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان على خاتم النبيين وسيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما إلى علمنا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Inshallah, we'll continue with reading from the book known as al-Awsat في السنن والإجماع والاختلاف أو من السنن والإجماع والاختلاف. That medium-sized book containing the narrations that deal with legislation as well as the consensus of the scholars and their disagreement. A book that was compiled by Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Ibrahim ibn al-Mundhir rahimahullah ta'ala al-Naysaburi, who died in the year 318 after the Hijrah. And we're in the second section of his book, the section he entitled Kitaab al-Miyaah, the section that deals with the various types of water. And we've been talking about some of the things that can change water and potentially alter its state from being pure and purifying, tahur, to being something lesser than that. And in the midst of that conversation, there comes the issue of dead animals. When they contaminate water, what does it do to the water? And we've talked about previously that meta or Karen, dead animals that haven't been slaughtered properly, there are several categories of them. And you have land animals that if they become meta, they become najis. And then you have sea creatures, sea animals, animals that live in water. When they die, what happens to them? Do they become najis or are they pure? And at first glimpse, everyone would say, no, akhi, they're pure. The hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-ma' huwa tahuru, al-ma'u, al-bahru huwa tahuru ma'uhu al-hillu maytatu. The sea. And remember, when we say the sea in Arabic, it includes fresh water, salt water, lakes, oceans, seas, ponds, rivers, and streams. All of these things they fall under the category of sea. So it's not just the English concept of, a sea, a large salty body of water that's smaller than an ocean, encompassed on all sides or encompassed by land. The point of it is that even though this might be our default or our disposition, and it's not anything wrong with that, we should be aware that there is disagreement in this issue. There is disagreement, scholarly disagreement, regarding sea creatures, sea animals that die, animals that live in the water that die therein. Whether it be the disagreement that relates to, do they only live in water or do they live on land and water? Or whether it be the issue of things that only live in water, but at the same point in time, can become contaminated upon death. Do they have flowing blood or not? Things like this we'll talk about potentially in this chapter. I don't know if he'll go into that much detail about it. But this chapter that's in front of us, he says, ذِكْرُ مَوْتِ الدَّوَابِ الَّتِي مَسَاكِينُهَا الْمَاء فِيهِ مِثْلُ السَّمَكِ وَالسَّرَطَانِ وَغَيْرُ ذَلِكَ أو وغير ذلك. ذِكْرُ مَوْتِ الدَّوَابِ الَّتِي مَسَاكِينُهَا الْمَاء فِيهِ مِثْلُ السَّمَكِ وَالسَّرَطَانِ وَغَيْرِ ذَلِكَ. What has been mentioned regarding creatures that take their abode, their home is in the water when they die in it, right? Creatures that live in water, if they die in the water, what is the status of those creatures and what is the status of that water? For example, fish and crabs and other than that, right? If a fish dies and you see dead fish floating on the surface of the water, what is the ruling of those fish? What is the ruling of that water? Likewise, crabs, whales, sharks, Likewise, seahorses, eels, snakes, alligators, right? All of these different animals, do we all say that they're the same? Is there a difference? That's what this chapter is about. What has been mentioned regarding animals that take their abode in the sea or in the water if they die therein. Animals like fish, crabs, and other than that. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, اختلف أهل العلم في السمك والضفدع والسرطان وما أشبه ذلك يموت في الماء. He says that the people of knowledge, they disagree regarding fish and frogs and crabs and things similar to that if they die in water. And you notice because these type of arguments, for example, like these are things that, this is why it's so important to, be abreast with Islamic law, because all of us know the hadith. It's water is pure and purifying. Its caring is halal. But what about sea creatures that die on land? If I take a fish out of the water and throw it on land and it dies, and I didn't slaughter it, is it tahir or najis? Because is it still considered the sea creature now, right? It hasn't died in water. And so these are just subtleties that, cause the scholars to disagree. So you notice when he says this statement, the people of knowledge, they disagree about fish, frogs, and crabs and things similar to that die in the water. So this conversation is about when they die in the water, not if they die out of the water. He says, فَكَانَ مَالِكْ لَا يَرَى ذَلِكَ يُفْسِدُهُ وهو قول أبي عبيد وكذلك قال الشافعي في الحوت والجراد يموت في الماء أن ذلك لا ينجسه وهذا قول محمد بن الحسن في الضفدع والسرطان يموت في الماء وكذلك قال النعمان فيهما وفي السمكة تموت في الماء. He says that, so Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, he used to hold the view that doesn't ruin the creature. It doesn't cause the creature to be ruined, fasad, right? It doesn't take it out of its permissible state. So a view of Malik, and you have to know that the Maliki madhab is one of the most allowing as it relates to animals and meats and things like that. The Maliki madhab, Imam Malik, he said that any animal that dies in the water, i.e. from those animals that have their home in the water, then this doesn't corrupt them. This doesn't ruin them. It doesn't cause them to become rotten by dying in the water. i.e. they are still permissible to eat, and therefore they don't have any contaminating effect upon the water. He says, and this is also the view of Abi Ubaid. Abu Ubaid, who al-Qasim ibn Salam. Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam. He says, and likewise, this is the statement of Ash-Shafi'i. This was also stated by Ash-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, regarding the hoot. And the hoot is the whale, right? The porpoise, those big animals, right, that we know as whales and things like that, dolphins, things like that, the hoot. As well as the jarad, right? Shafi'i said that this is applicable to the whale, and this is why that's important, because the whale has flowing blood, right? The whale has flowing blood. It's a mammal. And so when it comes to fish or crabs or, things like this, you might differ regarding it. But as Shafi'i said, this is applicable. This was his statement, i.e. it doesn't corrupt the animal if it dies in water. And this is applicable to the hoot, the whale, as well as the locusts, which are insects, right? Those locusts, and even though locusts, as far as I know, they don't take their home in water. But these are insects that don't have this flowing blood. So if they die in the water, there might be a swarm that goes over water and they fall into the water and drown or die in the water. These sea insects or even land insects, he says, if they die in وَالْجَرَادْ يَمُوتُ فِي الْمَاءِ أَنَّ ذَلِكَ لَا يُنَجِّسُهُ. Right? If these insects like locusts die in water, then that doesn't contaminate it. So not only do the animals that take their abode in water, if they die in the water, they don't contaminate it. Likewise, those insects and things that don't have flowing blood, that don't become najis when they die, if they die in water, they don't contaminate it. That's basically what Ash-Shafi'i is saying. He says, وَهَذَا قَوْلُ Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. And this is also the statement of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan regarding the frog and the crab if they die in water. Right? The frog and crab, why this is important is because the frog and the crab, they are barmawi, right? They're animals that live on land and water, right? The crab can be in land and water. The frog can be on land and water. And so even if these animals die in water, they don't become najis because their abode is in the water as well. And so therefore they don't contaminate the water. He says, وَكَذَلِكَ قَالَ النُّعْمَانِ فِيهِمَا وَفِي السَّمَكَ تَمُوتُ فِي الْمَاءِ. And this was also the view, or this was also said by An-Nu'man, Abu Hanifa, his teacher, and he's the teacher of Muhammad ibn Hasan, regarding the two of them, the frog and the crab, as well as the fish that dies in water. And so these different opinions are because some of them differentiate from Barmawi, amphibians, animals that, or I don't know if amphibian is the right term, but animals that can live on land and sea. And some of them differentiate between animals that are mammals or have flowing blood that live in the water. And some of them make it restricted to only fish, while some of them open it up to any animal that lives in the sea. And so he's mentioning these statements about those who say to some extent that no contamination occurs, whether it be the view of Malik, generally speaking, which was also adopted by Abu Ubaid in a similar statement by Ash-Shafi'i, or whether it be the statement of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan and the Hanafis that kind of restricted to those animals like fish specifically, or those animals that don't have flowing blood or are small in stature and size, like frogs and things like that. He says, وحكي عن ابن المبارك أنه قال في الضفدع يموت في ماء البر في ماء البئر ينزح ماء البئر كله أو ينزح ماء البئر كله ينزح ماء البئر كله. وقال يعقوب في الضفدع كما قال ابن المبارك إذا مات في البئر نجسها. طيب, one thing to pay attention to in this topic is that in all of these situations, for the previous people that we've mentioned, it doesn't matter which water the animal dies in, whether they die in water that was their natural abode or whether they die in some other water. So, for example, a saltwater fish, if you take it and put it into fresh water, it will die. Or a freshwater fish, if you put it into salt water, it will die. But that fish, since its home is water, it doesn't become contaminated, nor does it contaminate the water. So to whatever extent you agree with the previous statements, whether it's restricted to just fish or inclusive of fish and frogs and crabs, or even reaching the mammals or all animals, it doesn't matter in which water those animals die in. because they are water animals, they don't contaminate the water. But in the second opinion, he says it's been mentioned regarding, or it's been mentioned from Ibn al-Mubarak, or about Ibn al-Mubarak, that he said regarding the frog that dies in a well. You have a frog that dies in a well. The well is not the natural abode of this frog. This well is a man-made contraption. It's something that we dug out and got to the water table and allowed it to fill. But that being the case, a frog might find his way therein, right? A frog might come from the creek, might come from another planet, and they look for the water. He hops into the well, but is unable to get himself out and thus dies in the well. The frog, the toad, and it could be a small one, it could be a large one, right? And now you have this frog decomposing in the well water. The previous view, no problem. It's a water animal. It doesn't contaminate the water, and it itself doesn't become najis. But according to Ibn al-Mubarak, he said regarding the frog that dies in well water, that the entirety of the well water needs to be yunzah. It needs to be extracted, right? You have to get all of that water out of the well and then allow it to refill. And this would obviously be because he sees the dead frog as becoming najis when it dies in the well water. Similar to how we talked about previously regarding a chicken or something like that that might fall into the well. And Ibn Mundhir, he says, and this was stated by Yaqub, Abu Yusuf, the other student of Abu Hanifa, regarding a frog, similar to the statement of Ibn al-Mubarak. And remember, Ibn al-Mubarak was Hanafi, right? He was a scholar who, benefited and learned from Abu Hanifa and his students. So there's no strangeness that their statements would align. So Abu Yusuf Yaqub, he said regarding a frog that dies in a well, similar to what Ibn al-Mubarak said, if it dies in the well, it contaminates it. It makes it najis. That frog, if it dies in a well, and the well is going to be a small amount of water, if a frog dies in it, it contaminates it. It makes the water najis. So those are the two varying views, right? And these varying views have details in them, but the only detail that he wants to focus on right now is the state of the water. So he doesn't want to talk about the state of the animal. So in the first opinion, regardless of what view you take about the state of the animal, if the animal doesn't contaminate or doesn't become contaminated or najis upon death in water, then it doesn't contaminate the water regardless of the water that it dies in, whether it be in its natural abode or in a different tank. Like how we might get a fish tank and we take the fish out of its home, we buy a fish, we put it in the fish tank, and then it dies. This fish has died in water other than its natural abode. This is the first opinion, it doesn't contaminate. The second opinion is that if it's one of those animals, like a frog specifically is what he mentions, and so you could say it's because it's a land water animal, a barmawi, a land water animal, or you could say because it's in other than its natural habitat, that if it dies in that water, it contaminates it. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says, قال أبو بكر قد احتج بعضهم في ذلك بقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم هو الطهور ماؤه الحل ميتته فزعم أن ذلك يأتي على كل ما مات في البحر من دوابه التي تكون فيه واحتج بحديث جابر في الدابة التي وجدت على ساحل البحر ميتة فأكلها أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فذكر ذلك للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال هل معكم من لحمها شيء؟ قال فهذا يدل على أن دواب البحر كلها حل من سمك وغيره. He says, Abu Bakr, he says that some of the people, they use as a proof in this topic the statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam regarding the seawater. It is tahur as it relates to its water, and it is halal as it relates to the animals that die therein. Ibn Mundhir, he says, so they claim that this is applicable to every animal that dies in the sea or in water from those animals that live in water. Right? This would be close to the view of Imam Malik, right? Every animal that lives in water, if it dies in water, then this statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is applicable. He says in some of them, they also use the hadith of Jabir, and Jabir ibn Abdullah, regarding that animal that they found on the banks or the beach of the sea or the banks of the sea, dead. And he's referring to that whale that they found that was known as Ambar, that large whale that they found. And that story of him can be found. We covered it, I believe, in the Thulathiyat of the Musnad of Imam Ahmed. He says, so he ate from it, or the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they ate from this animal. And this animal was dead outside of the sea. And this is a big issue later on when we talk about the condition of the animal. But since it was a sea animal that was thrown out of the sea and died on land, a beached whale, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they ate from it. And that was mentioned to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said to them, do you all have any of its meat with you? All right, does any of its meat remain? Did you bring any of its meat back with you? I.e., to show the permissibility and the acceptability of what they did. Because at first, Abu Ubaid ibn al-Jarrah, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, he didn't want to allow them to eat from it. And then he allowed them to eat from it, and then they informed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ibn Mundhir, he says, so this proves that the sea animals or the water animals, all of them are halal as it relates to fish or other than them. And this is because, as we mentioned, some of them, they restrict the permissibility to just fish. But as we see these two hadith, the hadith of Ambar, they both prove the acceptability of every sea animal. And if the animal is not najis, then it doesn't contaminate the water, regardless if it dies in its natural habitat or outside of its natural habitat. And so this is the chapter that the author brought regarding this. You see, he didn't go into too much depth or too much detail about it, because the depth will be in the topic of the permissibility of the animal. And so the summarization of it is just simply, if the animal itself is tahir, then the water doesn't become najis, even if the animal dies in it. And that's basically the gist of what he's talking about, regardless if it's its natural habitat or an alternative body of water. While some of them exclude it dying in an alternative body of water, specifically, as we mentioned, regarding the frog. We can stop at that amount. And we'll come up next time with the next chapter regarding a well that's next to a balu'a. And a balu'a, if I'm not mistaken, is a sewer or like a... We'll talk about it then. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.